The Duke had never trusted affection that arrived too eagerly. He had watched men lose empires for women who smiled sweetly while calculating advantage, and he had buried a father whose legacy had been traded away through sentiment disguised as love. By the time the title became his, he had already decided that emotions were the most expensive currency a man could ever spend, and that the only thing worth testing was motive. Gold, he believed, did not lie. Gold did not pretend. Gold revealed. For months, whispers had filled his drawing rooms about marriage, daughters of influential houses, well-educated heiresses whose eyes sparkled a little too brightly whenever he entered a room. Each one had been trained in charm and restraint, every gesture rehearsed to suggest sincerity without surrender. He endured their company with the patience of someone who understood strategy better than pleasure. But the pattern bored him. All of them knew how to look devoted when wealth was within reach. None of them had ever been forced to reveal who they were when no one was watching. So he designed a test that would strip performance down to instinct. The invitations were written in formal script, sealed with his crest, and delivered simultaneously so no one could compare notes. 3 women arrived from houses so old that their family portraits filled entire wings of their estates. Another came from a noble line that had lost its fortune but not its pride, clinging desperately to appearances as if silk could replace solvency. And then there was the 5th. Her name was Leora, though few in the household bothered to remember it. She was a maid who had worked the East Wing for years, moving through corridors with practiced invisibility, cleaning rooms she was not permitted to linger in, overhearing conversations she was expected to forget. She did not own fine dresses. She did not dine at the long tables set for guests. She existed in the quiet machinery of service, essential but unnoticed. When the messenger delivered the invitation to her hands, she stared at the seal as though it were a mistake. By the time the 5 women were gathered in the great hall, the contrast between them was unmistakable. The heiresses stood together instinctively, silk brushing silk, their laughter light and unburdened. The woman from the fading noble line wore elegance like armor, every movement calculated to preserve dignity. Leora stood apart, her uniform plain, her hands folded low, her gaze fixed respectfully on the marble floor. The Duke entered without ceremony. He did not introduce himself, his presence was introduction enough. Silence fell not because he demanded it, but because the room understood him. He did not look at them with curiosity. He looked at them the way a jeweler examines stones, searching not for beauty, but for authenticity. "Each of you will receive £5,000, he said, his voice carrying easily across the vast space. You will have 3 days, spend it as you see fit. Buy what you desire. Invest it, waste it, hide it. I do not care. What matters is what you bring back with you and what it reveals." The words were not framed as a challenge. They were framed as inevitability. Servants moved forward, placing sealed envelopes into each woman's hand. The heiresses accepted theirs with amusement, already whispering about gowns and jewelers. The noblewoman from the failing house pressed the envelope to her chest, as though its contents could rewrite her family's fate. Leora received hers last. She felt the weight of it settle into her palm like something alive. The Duke's eyes paused on her, just long enough to acknowledge her presence. "You are dismissed." They left the hall in a flurry of silk and speculation. Leora remained still for a heartbeat longer, uncertain whether the dismissal included her. It did. She bowed slightly and followed, her steps measured, her mind racing with possibilities she had never been allowed to entertain. That night, while the other women planned their purchases with excited deliberation, Leora sat on the edge of her narrow bed and unfolded the notes one by one. The sum was not abstract to her. It was not a number on a ledger. It was food, shelter, medicine, possibility. It was more than she had earned in years of labor, more than her mother had ever held at once. Her hands trembled not with greed, but with the weight of choice. The Duke believed money exposed desire. Leora understood something different. Money exposed responsibility. She thought of the market she passed each morning, the same children begging outside the bakery, the same woman sleeping beneath the chapel steps, the same crates of unsold bread discarded at dusk. She thought of the kitchens in the estate, where food was prepared in abundance and discarded in silence. She thought of herself, scrubbing marble floors while hunger hid behind politeness. By dawn, the heiresses were already on their way to the city's finest establishments, carriages lined with anticipation. Leora walked alone through narrow streets most nobles had never seen, the envelope hidden beneath her cloak, her heart pounding not with excitement, but with intention. She did not know what the Duke wanted to see, but she knew exactly what needed to be done. The second day began before sunrise, not because Leora had slept poorly, but because her mind had refused to rest. The envelope lay open on the small wooden table, its contents already counted, organized, and assigned purpose. Where the other women had treated the Duke's challenge like a theatrical indulgence, Leora approached it the way one approaches a storm, knowing that careless movement could destroy more than it revealed. She stepped into the street while the city was still half asleep. Vendors were only beginning to lift shutters, their breath forming pale clouds in the morning air. This was the hour she knew best, the hour before privilege arrived. She moved with quiet certainty, avoiding the broad avenues where the heiresses would later parade their purchases. Instead, she walked through the forgotten arteries of the city, where money did not sparkle but sustained. Her first stop was the old apothecary near the river, a place she had once entered on behalf of a sick servant who could not afford to be seen begging. The owner looked up in surprise when Leora entered, accustomed to her apologetic visits, her careful questions about discounts. Today she did not ask for mercy. She asked for inventory. She bought fever medicine, bandages, salves, supplies that vanished daily into the quiet suffering of those who were never invited to the Duke's halls. The apothecary hesitated, uncomfortable with the amount she placed on the counter. Leora did not explain. She only asked that the items be delivered to the chapel by nightfall. From there she went to the baker who always discarded bread after sunset, and she did not negotiate price, she negotiated purpose. She paid for surplus, for yesterday's loaves and tomorrow's excess, arranging deliveries to the shelter on the South Road where children waited each evening pretending not to be hungry. The baker blinked at her, uncertain whether to question the sudden generosity. But hunger does not ask why it is fed. She moved through the day like this, not hurried but deliberate, her cloak gradually lightening as the envelope emptied. At the tailor's she did not buy dresses. She bought coats, thick ones, durable ones, the kind designed to endure winters that arrive without mercy. She remembered the feel of frost in her childhood bones, how cold seeps inward long before it reaches skin. These coats would go to those who knew that cold well. At midday she passed the fountain in the square, where the other women were already seated at outdoor tables, laughing over sparkling wine, comparing silks. She did not look at them, not out of bitterness, but because their world no longer intersected with hers. The Duke had asked what the money would reveal. Leora was not interested in revealing herself to him. She was interested in revealing something to the city. By evening, exhaustion settled into her limbs, but she did not stop. She spent the remainder of the funds arranging food deliveries, negotiating reduced costs for future weeks rather than immediate gratification. She left deposits with merchants who had never expected someone like her to speak the language of investment. They looked at her differently when she did, less like a servant, more like a force they had not anticipated. The third day dawned quieter. The envelope was empty. The silence that followed was not fear, it was resolve. Leora did not feel deprived, she felt anchored. The money was no longer something she possessed, it was something she had set in motion. And as she walked through the neighborhoods she had touched, she watched change ripple outward. Children holding warm bread. A woman near the chapel wrapped in a coat too large for her, laughing softly at the sleeves. A man whose fever had broken, sitting upright against a wall instead of lying still beneath it. She did not announce herself. She simply watched. Elsewhere, the Duke's other guests were concluding their own interpretations of the test. The heiresses returned with jewelry cases, perfumes imported at scandalous cost, gowns cut from fabric that shimmered even in candlelight. The woman from the failing noble house had invested in elaborate home furnishings meant to suggest wealth she no longer possessed. Each of them had created a portrait of aspiration, of belonging beside a man who measured worth in refinement. They gathered again in the great hall at dusk, their prizes arranged like offerings. The Duke walked among them slowly, lifting a necklace here, brushing fingers across silk there, nodding with the faint approval of someone who had expected nothing less. The women preened subtly, waiting for his judgment. Then Leora entered. She carried no box, no parcel, her hands were empty. The room stilled, not with authority this time but confusion. She stood before him, unadorned, her posture calm. When he asked what she had purchased, she did not list items. She spoke instead of places, of the chapel near the river, of the children by the shelter, of the baker who no longer discarded food because there was now a reason not to. She told him where the money had gone, not as a performance but as a report. The Duke said nothing at first. He had expected extravagance. He had expected spectacle. What he had not expected was absence. The absence of proof he could hold in his hand, the absence of wealth he could weigh, and in that absence something unsettled him deeply. Gold, he had believed, never lied. But standing before him was a woman who had spent it in ways he could not display and could not dismiss. Silence filled the great hall after Leora finished speaking, not the tense kind that anticipates applause, but the heavier kind that follows disruption. The Duke remained still at the head of the room, his fingers resting lightly against the back of an empty chair, his expression unreadable. Around him, the other women shifted uncomfortably, their jewels and silks suddenly feeling too loud, too visible, as though every glittering surface were reflecting something they did not wish to see. The first heiress broke the quiet with a nervous laugh. "So," she said, lifting her velvet box slightly as if to remind the room of its worth, "you spent everything on charity." The word charity carried a faint edge of dismissal, as though kindness required apology. Leora did not react to the tone. She met the woman's gaze steadily. "I spent it on people," she replied. "The money only existed to make that possible." The Duke's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. It was not defiance that intrigued him, it was certainty. He asked the others to present what they had acquired. One by one they stepped forward. There were rings cut from stones rare enough to be spoken of in whispers, gowns stitched so finely that even the seams seemed ornamental. One woman had invested in a small but impressive portfolio of art, each piece selected for its future resale value. They spoke eagerly, each explanation framed to suggest intelligence, discernment, refinement. The Duke listened with polite attention, nodding at appropriate moments, his gaze never lingering long. Then he turned back to Leora. "You bring me nothing," he said. "I bring you what the money became," she answered. That was when the atmosphere changed. The Duke had not anticipated being challenged in the language of philosophy by someone whose duties normally included polishing floors and clearing plates. The other women watched with poorly concealed fascination. This was not the contest they had prepared for. They had expected comparison, not contradiction. "What you did," the Duke said carefully, "cannot be evaluated." Leora did not flinch. "It can," she said, "just not by what fits on a table." His lips tightened. "You assume I wanted to be moved." She shook her head slowly. "No, I assume you wanted to be shown something." There was no accusation in her voice, only an observation that landed like one. The Duke straightened, folding his arms loosely across his chest. He had designed this test to expose greed. Instead, it had exposed something far more inconvenient, his own narrow definition of worth. "You were given the same opportunity as the others," he said. "They invested in assets." "So did I," Leora replied. The simplicity of her answer unsettled him. He had expected justification, perhaps even embarrassment. What he found instead was assurance that required no approval. He dismissed the women without comment, instructing them to return to their accommodations. As they left, the contrast between glitter and emptiness followed them, the sound of silk brushing marble echoing uncomfortably. Leora lingered only because he had not yet told her to go. "Why?" he asked once the room was clear. The question was not harsh, it was curious. She considered her answer. "Because I have been hungry," she said, "and because I have watched people suffer while money passed through hands that did not need it." "That does not make it wise," he said. "It makes it necessary." He studied her in silence, as though seeing her for the first time rather than as part of the machinery that kept his estate functioning. He had never asked who she was beyond her duties. Now, the absence of that knowledge felt strangely negligent. "You believe wealth exists to be spent," he said. "I believe wealth exists to be used," she corrected. He did not dismiss her. He did not argue. Instead, he did something entirely unexpected. He ordered the carriage prepared. They traveled that night not in comfort, but in anonymity. The Duke dressed plainly, his crest concealed. Leora did not ask why. She only told him where to go. The streets were unfamiliar to him, narrow and poorly lit, far from the polished avenues he associated with the city. He stepped down from the carriage with hesitation, his shoes unsuited to the uneven stone, his posture instinctively guarded. She led him to the chapel by the river. It was there that he saw the coats, draped across tired shoulders, sleeves too long, smiles unpracticed. He saw children tearing bread apart with the urgency of those who know food does not always come twice. He saw the apothecary unloading crates, murmuring thanks he did not expect to be overheard. "This is where the money went," Leora said quietly. The Duke felt something shift in his chest, an unfamiliar pressure, not quite regret, not quite awe. He had spent fortunes on things he could admire. He had never spent a single pound on something that did not belong to him. "Why show me this?" he asked. "Because you wanted to test who we were," she replied, "and because I want you to understand what your money can become when it stops reflecting you." He had no response to that. The following days were restless. He returned to the estate changed in ways he did not yet understand, his thoughts circling questions he had never asked himself. The women awaited his verdict, confident in their investments, unaware that the game had already escaped his control. When he finally summoned them again, he did not announce a winner. He announced that the test would continue. The women expected finality. They gathered in the great hall dressed to be chosen, each of them certain that whatever strange turn the Duke's experiment had taken, it would eventually return to something familiar: judgment, selection, resolution. Instead, what they received was uncertainty. "The test is not finished," the Duke announced, his voice carrying across the room with restrained intensity. "What I have seen cannot be measured in 3 days." Murmurs rippled through the group. The heiresses exchanged glances laced with irritation. They had spent generously, deliberately, crafting an image they believed he wanted. Leora stood apart, as she always had, listening rather than reacting. "I am not interested in spectacle," the Duke continued. "I am interested in consequence. For the next month, each of you will live not as guests, but as observers. You will see where money moves when it is not chasing beauty." The words unsettled them. He assigned them roles that stripped away privilege in small but significant ways. They were no longer escorted everywhere by servants. Their rooms were reduced in comfort. They were required to accompany estate staff into parts of the city they had never visited. It was not cruelty, it was exposure. He wanted them to understand not only how wealth is displayed, but how it is withheld. The heiresses resisted subtly at first. They complied outwardly while maintaining emotional distance, treating the streets like exhibits rather than environments. They spoke in hushed tones about inconvenience, about how the Duke's strange obsession with charity was unbecoming of his status. But the longer the days passed, the more difficult it became to ignore the reality around them. Poverty was not aesthetic. It did not perform gratitude. It simply endured. Leora did not instruct them. She accompanied them quietly, not as a guide, but as a presence that needed no explanation. She did not say this is what you should feel. She allowed experience to speak for itself. The others noticed how easily she moved through these spaces, how people greeted her not as a curiosity, but as someone familiar. It unsettled them more than any lecture could have. The Duke observed from a distance. He watched the heiresses struggle with discomfort, watched them recoil at sights they had never had to consider. He watched Leora kneel beside a sick woman and speak to her with the same respect she once used for nobles. And in that observation, he began to understand something that unsettled his worldview. Compassion did not weaken authority, it redefined it. One afternoon, he followed them into a tenement building so narrow it seemed to close in on him. The air was heavy with damp, and the faint metallic scent of sickness. He had been inside countless mansions, but never somewhere so stripped of performance. Children stared at him with the blunt curiosity of those who had never been taught to hide need. A young boy reached out and touched the cuff of his coat. "You're lost," the boy said, not unkindly. The Duke felt a sensation he had never encountered before: irrelevance. In this place, his title carried no meaning. His gold had not yet arrived. He was simply a man standing in a room that did not belong to him. Leora watched him absorb this without commentary. Later that evening, back at the estate, the Duke dismissed the women early. The heiresses retreated to their reduced quarters, unsettled, offended, uncertain. Leora returned to her work, though her duties had quietly shifted. She was no longer merely cleaning rooms. She was, without ceremony, shaping the direction of the Duke's experiment. He called for her after midnight. She entered his study with composure, though the room itself felt altered, less a place of command, more a place of reckoning. Papers lay scattered across the desk, not in disorder, but in contemplation. He gestured for her to sit, something no servant had ever been invited to do in that room. "You did not spend the money to impress me," he said. "No," she agreed. "You spent it, as though you never expected to see it again." "I didn't." He studied her, the way one studies a map to a place they did not know existed. "You did not try to change the others," he observed. "That would have defeated the purpose," she replied. "Understanding has to arrive uninvited." Silence settled between them, not heavy but thoughtful. The Duke leaned back, his gaze unfocused, as though measuring something internal rather than external. "For the first time," he said slowly, "I am questioning whether I have mistaken wealth for wisdom." She did not offer reassurance. "That question," she said, "is yours to answer." It was the most dangerous thing she could have said to a man accustomed to certainty. Outside, the estate slept, unaware that something foundational was shifting within its walls. The test that had begun as a demonstration of control had become a mirror, and the Duke was no longer certain he liked the reflection. The fifth day of the Duke's reckoning arrived not with rebellion, but with discomfort that had nowhere left to hide. The heiresses no longer whispered only among themselves. Their unease had begun to surface in sharp comments, in pauses that stretched too long, in glances that drifted instinctively toward Leora when no one else seemed to understand what they were being asked to become. It was subtle at first. One of them, Aveline, the youngest of the group, hesitated before stepping past a man lying against the wall outside the soup hall. The others continued without noticing. Leora paused. Aveline paused with her. They did not speak, but the silence stretched long enough to register. The man did not beg. He only looked up with tired eyes that had no energy left for performance. Aveline reached into her pocket before she realized what she was doing. She froze. The Duke had not instructed them to give anything. This was not part of the test as it had been explained. It was easier to walk away than to decide what was expected. Leora did not intervene. She simply watched. Aveline placed a coin in the man's hand and continued walking, her cheeks flushed, her steps uncertain. For the first time since arriving at the estate, she did not look toward the Duke for approval. That was how it began. Not with grand gestures, but with moments that refused to be ignored. The woman from the fading noble line, Isidora, had been the most vocal in her resistance. She complained of discomfort, of humiliation, of how such exposure diminished her status. Yet even she could not remain untouched. One afternoon, she lingered too long in a narrow alley where a woman was stitching worn fabric together with hands swollen from cold. Isidora had paid more for a single ribbon than this woman would earn in months. And yet, the woman's posture was not submissive. It was resolute. Pride does not disappear with poverty, it simply loses an audience. The Duke observed these shifts with measured interest. He did not intervene, he did not congratulate, he allowed the process to unfold without direction. For the first time, his authority was expressed through absence, and in that absence, something unexpected occurred. The women began to confront not what he wanted, but what they themselves believed. The estate felt different in the evenings. Conversations no longer centered on fashion or inheritance. They drifted instead toward the day's encounters, toward stories that could not be adorned with wealth. Leora listened, rarely contributing, allowing the others to arrive at their own conclusions. It was not that she withheld guidance, it was that guidance was no longer necessary. One night the Duke stood alone in the gallery, watching the women through the open doors of the drawing room. They were seated in a loose circle, no longer arranged by status or proximity to power. Their laughter was quieter now, not the polished sound of social performance, but something uncertain and sincere. He realized then that the test had ceased to belong to him. It was no longer about selection. It was about exposure, not of the women, but of the system that had shaped them. He summoned Leora again. This time, he did not wait until midnight. "You have altered them," he said. "I have not," she replied gently. "I've only stood where I always have." He frowned slightly, "And yet they are different." "They were never what you believed them to be," she said. "They were only what they had been taught to display." The Duke considered this. For years, he had measured worth through polish, through performance that aligned with his expectations. He had believed he was testing sincerity when, in truth, he had been testing conformity. "I wanted to know which of them would spend wisely," he said. "Wisely according to whom?" Leora asked. The question lingered, unanswered. Later that week, he arranged for the women to accompany him to the southern outskirts, where the estate owned land that had been left undeveloped for decades. It was there he revealed his intention, not to judge their purchases, but to redirect the resources they had invested. Jewelry would be sold. Art would be auctioned. Proceeds would be distributed according to needs identified by those who had now witnessed them firsthand. The heiresses were stunned. They had expected to be rewarded, not undone, but something had shifted within them. They did not protest, not loudly, not convincingly. Aveline nodded almost imperceptibly. Isadora looked down at her hands, the ring she had purchased suddenly heavy on her finger. The Duke turned to Leora last. "And you," he said, "what will you do when this ends?" She did not answer immediately. "I will return to my work," she said finally. "Not here, somewhere I am needed." The certainty in her voice unsettled him more than any rebellion could have. He had assumed, without realizing it, that her involvement was temporary, that she was responding to his invitation. It had not occurred to him that her purpose existed independently of his design. That night, as the estate settled into an unfamiliar quiet, the Duke stood in his study and acknowledged a truth he had avoided since the beginning. The poorest woman in the room had not only exposed the real gold. She had exposed him. The sixth phase of the Duke's test did not arrive with a proclamation. It arrived with a restlessness he could no longer ignore. For the first time since inheriting the estate, he found himself walking its corridors without destination, as though the walls themselves had begun to question him. The grandeur that once affirmed his authority now felt ornamental, heavy with assumptions he no longer trusted. The silence between rooms was not empty, it was interrogative. He thought of Leora often. Not as a servant, not as a curiosity, but as a disruption he had not anticipated. Her presence had unsettled the foundation of his beliefs without challenging his authority directly, and that made it impossible to dismiss. He had designed the test to expose greed. What it had exposed instead was the narrowness of his own perspective, and that realization demanded more than acknowledgement, it demanded change. He began with the smallest gesture he could trust himself to make. He canceled the gala scheduled for the following week, redirecting its funding toward the communities the women had been visiting. No speeches accompanied the decision. No announcement framed it as charity. It was simply done as though it had always been inevitable. The staff noticed. The women noticed. The city quietly noticed. Yet he did not tell Leora. He wanted to know whether his actions could exist without her validation. In the following days, he accompanied the women more frequently, not as an observer but as a participant. He listened rather than spoke. When disputes arose about distribution or priorities, he did not settle them by decree. He asked questions instead, a habit that felt unnatural, even dangerous. Power had always meant direction to him. Now it meant restraint. The shift was not without consequence. Some advisors expressed concern. They spoke of image, of precedent, of how generosity, if not framed correctly, could be mistaken for weakness. He heard them, but their words no longer settled comfortably within him. He had begun to understand that the greatest cost of authority was not money, but disconnection. It was during one of these excursions that the truth became impossible to ignore. They visited a row of houses recently abandoned after a failed development venture. The Duke had authorized the project years ago, confident in the return it would yield. The structure of the venture had looked impeccable on paper. He had never visited the site. Standing there now, among collapsed beams and broken windows, he saw families salvaging what little they could from homes they had been promised. A woman approached him, not with anger but with weary politeness. She did not recognize him as the Duke. She only saw a man in plain clothing, standing where authority had failed. "Are you here to take notes?" she asked. "No," he replied quietly. "I'm here to understand." She gestured around her. "Then understand this," she said. "We were told to trust people who never plan to stand here themselves." The words struck him harder than any accusation ever had. He had not intended harm, but intention, he was learning, was a fragile defense when detached from consequence. He had believed wealth created opportunity. He had not considered how distance could turn opportunity into abandonment. That night, he summoned Leora, not as part of the test, but as part of the reckoning. She entered his study without ceremony. He did not invite her to sit this time. He stood. "I am beginning to see what I have avoided," he said. She waited. "For years," he continued, "I believed that control protected me from error, that if I measured everything, people included, I could prevent loss. Instead, I have been measuring myself into irrelevance." She did not interrupt him. He spoke then of the abandoned houses, of the woman who had not known his name but had known his impact. He spoke of how easily systems designed for profit erase the people they claimed to serve. He spoke not with performance, but with unease. "I created this test," he said, "to choose a woman worthy of my wealth." "And now," she asked. "And now I do not know whether my wealth is worthy of anyone," he replied. It was not self-pity, it was recognition. Leora considered him carefully. "Awareness is not the end of change," she said. "It is the beginning of discomfort." He smiled faintly. "I am beginning to understand that." The next morning, he convened his advisors and announced a revision of the estate's financial strategy. Investments that had been designed solely for growth would now be evaluated for impact. Projects would no longer be approved without site visits, without listening to those affected. It was not charity, it was accountability. The advisors protested. He did not relent. The women watched this transformation with mixed emotion, some with curiosity, some with resistance, all with awareness that the test had outgrown its original purpose. Leora did not claim authorship of the change. She understood that it would only endure if it belonged to him. That evening, he walked the estate grounds alone. The moonlight fell across paths he had traveled countless times without seeing. The air felt different, not because the world had changed, but because he had begun to observe it without armor. He stopped beside the old fountain near the east wing, the part of the estate Leora had once cleaned in silence. The irony did not escape him. The place he had ignored was the place that had altered him most. For the first time since the test began, he allowed himself to name the truth. He had not been searching for a woman to join his world. He had been searching for a reason to change it. By the 7th week, the women no longer spoke about the Duke's test as though it were something being done to them. They spoke of it as something they were part of, an evolving experiment that had shed its original rules and begun to demand more of everyone involved. The jewelry purchased in the first days was no longer displayed. It had been sold quietly, the proceeds folded into projects that did not sparkle but endured. Shelters were expanded. Kitchens received funding. The once forgotten houses were reinforced with new beams, rather than abandoned promises. Yet the deeper transformation was not in the city. It was in the estate. The great halls felt different, not less grand but less performative. Servants no longer moved as shadows. They were invited into conversations, their insights considered rather than overlooked. The Duke insisted upon this change, correcting behavior that once went unquestioned. It unsettled the hierarchy without dismantling it, a recalibration rather than a revolt. Some resisted. Aveline embraced the shift with earnest confusion, her innocence colliding with a reality she had never been prepared to navigate. Isadora struggled. Her identity had been built upon distinction, upon being seen as elevated above the ordinary. Now she found herself confronting a truth that threatened to unmake her. Status without purpose is fragile. She approached Leora one evening, her voice low, uncertain. "You make it look effortless," she said. Leora did not look up from the ledger she was reviewing. "It is not effortless," she replied. "It is necessary." Isadora swallowed. "And if necessity costs you everything you were, then perhaps that is the cost of becoming someone you can stand behind." The words stayed with Isadora longer than she expected. The Duke watched these exchanges with an attentiveness that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. He was no longer measuring success through compliance. He was measuring it through coherence, how well actions aligned with the values they claimed to represent. It was exhausting. It was also the most honest work he had ever undertaken. One afternoon, he invited the women to review the estate's accounts. This was not symbolic, it was structural. They sat around the long table where decisions had once been made without them. Numbers filled the ledgers, rows of profit and loss that had previously existed only in abstraction. Now, each figure was paired with context: which project had displaced families, which investment had created jobs, which venture had failed to consider the human cost. The Duke did not lead the discussion. He facilitated it. Gold, stripped of mystique, revealed patterns. "This one," Aveline said hesitantly, pointing to a line item that once would have been meaningless to her. "Why is it increasing when the shelter nearby is struggling?" The Duke leaned forward. "Because that development generates immediate revenue," he said, "and because I never questioned what it replaced." The room grew quiet. They were no longer participants in a game. They were architects of a new framework. Leora said little. She did not need to. Her influence was no longer in what she said, but in how others now listened. When disagreements arose, they were no longer resolved by hierarchy, but by examination. The women began to challenge one another, not with rivalry but with sincerity. It was not harmony, it was accountability. Later that week, the Duke received a request from a neighboring estate, an invitation to invest in a luxury venture that promised high returns. In the past, he would have signed without hesitation. This time he declined. The refusal startled his advisors. "You are turning down profit," one of them said, unable to conceal frustration. "I am turning down erasure," the Duke replied. The phrase was not rehearsed. It surprised him as much as it did them. That evening, he sought out Leora as she prepared to leave for the night. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "whether this will last?" She considered the question carefully. "No," she said, "I wonder whether you will." He smiled faintly, not offended. "That is fair." The gold that once dictated behavior had lost its authority. It no longer served as proof of wisdom, only as a tool whose value depended entirely on intention. The Duke had not relinquished power, he had redefined it. And in doing so, he had made it possible for those around him to change not because they were instructed to, but because the environment itself had shifted. The city did not yet understand what was happening within the walls of the estate. It only felt the ripple effects: meals that arrived consistently, projects that did not disappear after publicity faded, leaders who listened rather than dictated. No one wrote songs about these changes. They did not need to. Leora walked home that night with a sense of quiet certainty. The Duke had once tested 5 women with his money. He had not expected the poorest among them to expose the real gold, not the currency of wealth, but the currency of attention, of humility, of the willingness to be transformed. And now, as the experiment outgrew its origin, she felt something unexpected. Not triumph. Relief. By the 8th phase of the Duke's reckoning, the original test had dissolved almost entirely. What remained was not competition but convergence, a gradual understanding among the women, the servants, and the Duke himself that the question had never been which of them deserved his wealth, but whether his wealth deserved the people it had so long overlooked. That shift unsettled everyone, because it removed the familiar architecture of reward and replaced it with something far more demanding: responsibility without guarantee. The Duke announced a new decision at the close of a long day that had involved site visits, tense negotiations, and the exhaustion that follows real change rather than symbolic gesture. "This will end," he said quietly to the gathered women. Not the work, but this structure. I will not choose among you. I will not crown a victor. What began as a test has become something else, and I will not distort it by pretending otherwise. The words were not what they had expected. For weeks, they had been living in a liminal space, neither guests nor equals, bound together by a purpose that no longer resembled courtship or competition. Now, with the promise of selection withdrawn, they were confronted with a more difficult truth. Whatever they had become during this process belonged to them alone. Aveline reacted first, her voice uncertain but sincere. If you are not choosing, she asked, what happens to us? The Duke did not answer immediately. He looked instead at Leora, who had been silent for much of the day, her expression composed but alert. He did not seek her approval. He sought her understanding. You return to yourselves, he said finally, not as you were when you arrived, but as you are now. The women exchanged glances that carried more weight than their initial rivalries ever had. Isadora spoke next, her voice lower than usual. And the work, she asked. The projects, the people, we don't just leave them behind. No, the Duke said, you don't. He outlined his intention to establish an independent trust, governed not by his advisors alone, but by a board that included voices from the communities they had visited. He did not frame it as benevolence. He framed it as restitution. This cannot belong to me, he said, not anymore. The silence that followed was not hesitation, it was recognition. Leora felt a familiar tightening in her chest, not fear, but awareness. This was the moment she had been quietly anticipating since the first night she had counted the money at her small table. The moment when the question of purpose would detach from the question of permission. Later that evening, the Duke asked her to stay behind. The estate was quiet, its corridors emptied of performance. He did not sit at his desk. He leaned against the window, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance. You will not stay, he said. It was not a question. Leora met his gaze. No. He nodded once, as though confirming something he had known but avoided naming. You could, he said, not as a maid, not as part of this test, you could stay as something else. The implication lingered unspoken between them. I won't, she replied. He did not argue. Why, he asked softly. Because this, she gestured faintly around the room, was never about belonging here. It was about remembering how not to. He absorbed her words in silence. In that silence, he understood the final boundary he could not negotiate with wealth or influence. She had not exposed the real gold in order to claim it. She had done so in order to move beyond it. You've changed this place, he said. She shook her head. You changed it, I only showed you where to look. The trust was established the following week. Documents were signed. Authority redistributed. The women prepared to leave, each carrying something that could not be appraised. Aveline left with resolve she had not possessed before. Isadora left with questions that would no longer let her hide behind elegance. The others departed with a gravity that had nothing to do with inheritance. Leora packed lightly. She did not announce her destination. She did not leave a forwarding address. Her work did not require recognition to continue. The Duke accompanied her to the gates in silence, his posture stripped of the command that once defined him. He did not thank her. Gratitude would have sounded too small. What you did, he said instead, cannot be undone. She smiled faintly, then let it continue without me. As the carriage carried her away, he did not follow. He stood at the gates until the road emptied, until the last echo of movement dissolved into stillness. For the first time, he felt the absence not as loss, but as invitation, an opening into a future he had not designed. The choice she had made could not be bought. And because of that, it mattered more than any fortune he had ever held. Leora's departure did not feel like escape. It felt like arrival, into a life she had been quietly preparing for long before the Duke ever placed an envelope in her hands. The carriage carried her beyond the iron gates of the estate, beyond the roads lined with stone walls and manicured hedges, and into a landscape where intention mattered more than inheritance. She did not look back, not because she resented what she left behind, but because she no longer needed to measure herself against it. Her first destination was not a city of grandeur, but a town small enough to listen. She arrived with little more than a satchel, a ledger, and a purpose that did not require announcement. Within days, she had found the places that had once gone unnoticed: an overcrowded schoolhouse, a kitchen that closed before sunset because it could not afford to remain open, a workshop filled with tools too old to attract investment but too necessary to be abandoned. She did not arrive as a benefactor. She arrived as a participant, learning names before making suggestions, listening before organizing. People were wary at first. They had seen charity arrive in banners and depart in silence. But Leora did not speak in promises. She spoke in questions. What did you need? What had you lost? What would last after she was gone? And when she did offer resources, they were framed not as gifts but as collaborations. She had learned too well how dignity erodes when help is presented as rescue rather than partnership. The trust established by the Duke had already begun to move funds into communities, but Leora had chosen not to operate within its structure. She wanted to remain close enough to consequence to feel its weight. And so, she worked with local leaders to identify priorities that could not be captured in reports: access to medicine for families that could not travel, apprenticeships for youths who had been told they were expendable, systems that prevented hunger rather than responding to it. The work was slow. It was meant to be. Months passed, then a year. The town changed, not dramatically but measurably. Children who had once waited outside bakeries now waited outside classrooms. The schoolhouse gained a second teacher. The kitchen remained open long enough for evening meals to become routine rather than luxury. The workshop attracted hands that had once been idle, and in those hands, pride returned. Leora did not take credit. When people asked her why she had chosen this place, she answered simply, "Because I was needed." She did not mention the Duke. She did not tell stories about the test or the wealth that had made it possible. That chapter had closed with intention. Her story had moved forward without spectacle. And yet, she was not untouched by what she had left behind. She received letters occasionally, not from the Duke, but from the women who had once stood beside her in the Great Hall. Aveline wrote of her decision to redirect her inheritance toward education. Isadora wrote of the discomfort that had led her to dismantle the hollow displays of status that once defined her life. They did not ask for guidance. They shared accountability. The trust continued to operate, now governed by voices that had once been excluded. The Duke had kept his promise to remain in the background. He did not seek to reclaim the narrative. His influence existed in systems rather than speeches. Once, years later, Leora heard his name mentioned in passing by a merchant who had benefited from one of the trust's projects. "They say he's different now," the man said without recognizing her, "that he listens." Leora smiled politely and said nothing. Because listening, she had learned, was not a reputation. It was a practice. One evening, she walked the edge of the town as the sun sank low, the air carrying the quiet hum of work concluding for the day. She passed the schoolhouse where laughter drifted through open windows, the kitchen where bread was cooling, the workshop where lights still burned in dedication rather than necessity. None of this would have impressed the Duke of years past. It would not have glittered or reflected status. But it endured. She stopped near a small bridge that crossed the stream at the edge of town. She had stood on bridges before, waiting, watching, measuring time in the absence of someone else's apology. That woman felt distant now, not in memory, but in identity. She had not waited for gratitude to change her life. She had built it. And somewhere far away, the Duke continued to unravel the architecture of power he had once mistaken for permanence. Not in her name, not in tribute, but because he could no longer pretend he had not seen what real gold looked like. Leora rested her hands against the railing and allowed herself a moment of reflection, not of pride, but of recognition. The test had never been about 5 women. It had been about a system that believed wealth could define worth. That belief had been dismantled not by argument, but by example. She walked on as the light faded, her steps steady, unburdened by legacy. She did not carry the Duke's fortune with her. She carried something rarer. Agency. Time has a way of testing transformation more ruthlessly than any single moment of resolve. The Duke discovered this in the months that followed Leora's departure. Without her presence, quiet but anchoring, the work he had begun faced its first true measure: consistency without witness. It is easy to change when someone is watching. It is far more difficult to persist when the person who inspired the shift has moved on and the world assumes you will return to what is comfortable. He did not. The trust expanded slowly, deliberately, structured to resist the kind of control he had once exercised without reflection. He removed himself from daily oversight, not because he no longer cared, but because care that clings too tightly becomes possession. His advisors protested this restraint. They had built careers on proximity to his authority, and authority diluted felt to them like abandonment. He listened to their concerns. Then he refused to restore the old hierarchy. Influence is not leadership, he said in one of their final meetings. Responsibility is. Words did not originate in a book or a doctrine. They had emerged from lived discomfort. He no longer trusted systems that relied on prestige alone. He insisted on site visits before approvals, on reports written by those directly affected rather than those who benefited. He learned to measure outcomes not by returns, but by continuity: whether a school remained open after funding expired, whether a workshop continued to hire, whether a community required less intervention over time. This was not philanthropy. It was revision. At first, the press framed his decisions as eccentric, then as radical, then, reluctantly, as effective. He did not correct their language. He no longer needed public approval to legitimize his choices. The work had become self-sustaining, no longer anchored to his identity. And in that detachment, he felt the first genuine satisfaction he had known since inheriting his title. He did not seek out Leora. He had learned that proximity was not proof of integrity. He allowed her to exist beyond the perimeter of his transformation, even as her absence continued to define its direction. Her influence had not been in instruction. It had been in contrast. And that contrast remained his compass long after she had vanished from his daily life. Years passed. The estate changed, not in architecture but in rhythm. Servants were promoted based on insight rather than lineage. Communities were consulted before expansion. Profits were redirected not as penance but as strategy, because systems that exclude inevitably collapse. The Duke had not become benevolent, he had become precise. Occasionally, he encountered resistance more subtle than opposition. Investors withdrew. Allies distanced themselves. People who had once praised his decisiveness now questioned his resolve. He accepted the consequences without resentment. He had not expected transformation to be applauded. He had expected it to be tested. And it was. There were nights when he stood alone in the East Wing, the part of the estate Leora had once cleaned, and listened to the echo of footsteps that were no longer there. He did not romanticize the memory. He did not rewrite the past as destiny. He simply acknowledged the origin of his reckoning and allowed gratitude to remain silent rather than performative. He received updates from the trust regularly, though he rarely attended meetings. The reports spoke of progress measured in retention, in community governance, in reduced dependency. They were not impressive documents. They were honest ones. One evening, as winter approached, he was presented with a proposal from a distant region, an opportunity to expand the trust's framework beyond its original boundaries. The plan was ambitious, uncertain, expensive. In the past, he would have analyzed risk in isolation. Now, he requested a delegation from the region itself. They arrived weeks later: local leaders, teachers, tradespeople, individuals who did not carry titles but carried consequence. He listened as they spoke not of needs alone, but of capacity. He did not promise funding. He asked what sustainability looked like from their perspective. "This isn't how things are usually done," one of his advisors murmured afterward. "No," the Duke replied, "it is how they must be done if they are to last." He approved the proposal only after its authors returned to revise it, incorporating feedback not from his office but from their own communities. The process was slow. It was also effective. The Duke had not become a savior. He had become accountable. He often thought of the first night he had stood in the chapel by the river, surrounded by coats too large and bread too quickly torn apart. That image had not faded. It had sharpened. It remained the benchmark against which he measured every decision. Gold, he had learned, does not reveal truth by itself. Truth emerges only when gold is no longer allowed to speak alone. The town Leora had chosen did not appear on maps of influence. It had no monuments worth engraving into memory, no estates whose walls told stories of conquest or lineage. And yet, when the Duke finally arrived there, years after the test had dissolved into transformation, it felt less like discovery than acknowledgement. He did not announce his visit. He did not arrive with entourage or expectation. He came alone, dressed plainly, carrying no authority except the kind that is felt only when it is no longer imposed. He had not planned to come. The decision emerged quietly, as many of his most honest choices now did. A report from the trust mentioned a regional initiative that had taken root without direct funding, an anomaly worth understanding. The town was named without description, no credit assigned, just outcomes. He recognized the pattern immediately. Leora had never believed in intervention that left fingerprints. He arrived on a gray morning, the sky low enough to make the rooftops feel intimate. The town greeted him without recognition. That anonymity was a relief. He walked its narrow streets slowly, absorbing the details that would once have escaped him: the schoolhouse with its second floor, the kitchen that remained open after dusk, the workshop humming with purpose. None of it carried a plaque. None of it advertised benefaction. It was simply present, functioning without performance. He asked for directions not to a person, but to a place, the bridge at the edge of town that appeared in the report's marginal note. He did not know why that detail had caught his attention, only that it had. She was not difficult to find. Leora stood near the railing, speaking with a group of children who were arguing earnestly over the merits of a project they were building together, some crude model of a water wheel made from scraps. She did not notice him at first. He watched from a distance, not intruding, aware of the weight his presence might carry if he stepped too close too soon. When she finally turned, their eyes met without surprise. There was no visible reaction, no shock, no resentment, no warmth that demanded response, just recognition tempered by time. "You're far from home," she said. "So are you," he replied. They stood there in the quiet that followed, neither reaching for the other's past. The children dispersed, unconcerned with the significance of the moment, and the bridge reclaimed its stillness. He did not apologize. He had learned that apologies offered in pursuit of reconciliation are not apologies at all. They are invitations, and he was not there to ask for anything. "I wanted to see what had endured," he said. She nodded slightly, as though he had confirmed something she already knew. "And it has," he replied. They walked through the town together without ceremony. She introduced him to people not as the Duke, but as a visitor. He accepted the role easily. It required less of him. They spoke of logistics, of infrastructure, of how initiatives had been shaped by the town's own leadership rather than external expectation. She did not claim ownership of the work. She spoke as a participant among many. "You could have attached your name to this," he said quietly at one point. "I didn't need to," she replied. "If it requires attribution to exist, it isn't built to last." The words were not a rebuke, they were a principle. They paused outside the schoolhouse, watching children file out with books tucked under arms that once had little to carry. The Duke felt the weight of history pressing lightly against his back, not the burden of regret, but the continuity of consequence. This place had not emerged from wealth alone. It had emerged from alignment between resources and respect. "I never thanked you," he said. She met his gaze calmly. "I never needed it." He absorbed the response without defensiveness. The silence that followed was not unresolved, it was complete. They did not speak of the test. They did not speak of the women who had once stood in a great hall holding envelopes that would alter their lives. Those details belonged to an earlier architecture of meaning. What mattered now was not how they had arrived here, but what had become possible in the absence of spectacle. Before he left, they returned to the bridge. He did not ask whether she would ever return to the estate. He had learned that such questions seek comfort, not clarity. Instead, he said, "You didn't just expose the real gold." She waited. "You taught me how to step out of its shadow." She smiled faintly, not with pride, but with recognition of a truth that no longer needed reinforcement. He did not extend his hand. He did not offer future contact. He turned and walked away. The town resumed its rhythm, as though nothing remarkable had occurred. And perhaps nothing had. Because transformation, when genuine, does not announce reunion. It does not ask to be witnessed. It simply continues, unnoticed by those who once mistook silence for insignificance. The road away from the town curved gently into open countryside, and as the Duke followed it, he felt something he had not felt since before the test began. Not satisfaction, not relief, but stillness. It was the kind of stillness that does not belong to endings, but to continuations. He did not mark the moment as closure. He had learned, from Leora more than from anyone else, that the most enduring changes refuse to be framed. The estate waited for him with its familiar symmetry, its stone walls unmarred by doubt. But when he crossed the threshold this time, he did not feel the old sense of ownership. He felt stewardship. The distinction was subtle, yet it had reshaped every decision he now made. Power had once been something he wielded. Now it was something he maintained only insofar as it allowed others to stand more firmly on their own ground. In the weeks that followed, the Trust finalized its most ambitious initiative yet, a regional framework designed to operate independently of his estate's oversight. It was not branded with his name. It did not require his presence. It would succeed or fail on its own merits, guided by those who understood its consequences intimately. When his advisors raised concerns about dilution of legacy, he responded without hesitation. Legacy that requires control is not legacy, he said. It is insurance against irrelevance. They did not argue. They were learning, as he had, that the old language of authority no longer translated into sustainability. Elsewhere, Leora continued her work without reference to him. She moved between communities, not as an emissary but as a collaborator. She had learned to recognize patterns, how projects collapsed when imposed from above, how dignity flourished when solutions were shaped locally. She built systems that assumed her eventual absence, because endurance had never been about presence. It had been about preparation. The women who had once stood beside her in the Great Hall did not fade back into obscurity. They had changed in quieter ways, redirecting inheritances, declining alliances that demanded silence, choosing paths that had not existed for them before the test. They did not form a society or declare a movement. They lived differently, and that difference rippled outward in ways no one tracked formally, but many felt. Years passed. Children who had once learned beneath leaking roofs graduated from classrooms that no longer smelled of damp. Apprentices opened workshops of their own, hiring others who had once been told they were unskilled. Communities that had depended on irregular charity now governed their own resources with confidence rather than gratitude. The Trust's reports became increasingly sparse, not because it had failed, but because it had become less necessary. One autumn evening, long after the story of the Duke's test had faded from casual memory, a merchant passing through the town asked a local woman how the place had changed so profoundly. "We stopped waiting to be chosen," she replied. That sentence, though never recorded, was the clearest summary of what had endured. Gold had once defined the beginning of the Duke's reckoning. It had shaped the experiment, framed the competition, set the stage for a revelation he had not anticipated. But gold had not defined the outcome. It had simply been the catalyst for a truth that required no currency to persist. The real gold had not been the money he distributed or the systems he restructured. It had not been the power he relinquished or the authority he recalibrated. It had been the willingness to listen, to be displaced from certainty, to accept that worth is not bestowed by wealth but revealed by attention. On a quiet morning, years later, the Duke stood in the east wing of the estate, the corridor Leora had once walked in silence, and watched the light fall across walls that had outlived their original purpose. He did not imagine her there. He did not romanticize the past. He simply acknowledged the origin of a transformation that had become too expansive to belong to any single person. He turned away without ceremony. Not because the story had ended, but because it had moved beyond narration. And somewhere, in a town too small to name on a map of influence, Leora walked between classrooms and kitchens, between questions and possibilities, carrying nothing that could be appraised, and everything that could be sustained. The Duke had tested 5 women with his money. The poorest among them had exposed the real gold, and the world slowly had learned how to keep it.